Victor Harrow's fist came down on the table so hard the lantern jumped. "Find him," he said, "and make sure nobody in this town ever learns his name." The two men across from him didn't nod slowly or exchange nervous glances. They just stood up, tucked their hats, and walked out. That was the thing about Harrow's men. They didn't need to be told twice. They didn't need to be told much of anything. After 6 years of watching what happened to the ones who asked questions, they had learned that the fastest way to stay alive in Blackstone Hollow was to do exactly what Victor Harrow said, when he said it, without ever letting yourself wonder why. Outside the window, the mining town was already dark. Somewhere in it, a stranger had just ordered a whiskey. He didn't know yet that by morning, 3 men would be sent to make sure he never ordered another. If you were sitting in that saloon tonight, if you looked up from your glass and saw those men walk through the door, what would you do? This is the story of the man who already knew the answer before they even reached for their guns. If this kind of story speaks to you, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button. Every week we bring you tales like this one, and we'd love to know how far this story travels. Drop a comment and tell us what city or country you're watching from. It means more than you know. Now, let's begin. The Dust River Saloon was not a place that invited honesty. It was the kind of room that had absorbed too many lies over too many years. In the floorboards, in the bar counter, in the walls themselves, which had soaked up whiskey and blood and shouted threats until they smelled permanently of something that wasn't quite any of those things, but was all of them at once. The lamps hung low and threw shadows that favored nobody. The mirror behind the bar had a crack running from the upper left corner diagonally across the middle, and depending on where you stood, your reflection either looked younger than you were, or like something dug up from the earth. Elias Vane stood at the bar and looked at neither version of himself. He had been in Blackstone Hollow for exactly 4 hours when he walked through that door. Long enough to see the town, long enough to understand it, not long enough to have made a single friend, which was fine by him. Friends in a town like this were a liability you hadn't budgeted for yet. He set his saddlebags on the floor beside him and ordered 1 whiskey. Not 2. Not a bottle. 1 glass, neat, which was either the mark of a man with discipline or a man who needed to stay sharp. And in Elias's case, it was both. The bartender, a wide, florid man named Denton, who kept a sawed-off under the counter and hadn't used it in 3 years, though not for lack of opportunity, poured without looking at him. That was already unusual. Denton looked at everyone who came through that door. He had learned to assess a man in the first 2 seconds of eye contact, and his assessments had kept him alive in a town where that was no easy feat. But this man, this quiet one with the road dust still on his collar, Denton found himself not wanting to look at directly. It was like trying to stare at something that had already calculated you before you got there. Elias took his glass and turned so his back was at a 45-degree angle to the bar. Not fully against the wall, not fully facing the room, just enough of both to see everything without announcing that he was seeing it. He had been doing this since he was 19 years old, and it had become as natural as breathing. The room had 11 people in it. 9 of them belonged there. Miners with their end-of-week aches still on their faces, a card dealer who worked with the mechanical precision of someone who had long ago stopped caring whether anyone won or lost. 2 women who worked the room with the careful efficiency of people who had also long ago stopped expecting anything to be simple. The remaining 2 people were men. Elias had clocked the moment he walked in, before he even ordered, because they were sitting at a table doing a very convincing impression of men who were comfortable. They weren't comfortable. They were waiting. Elias sipped his whiskey and let them wait. He had come to Blackstone Hollow following a thread. That was how he thought about it. Not a lead, not a clue, not a mission. A thread. You pulled on it gently, and you followed it, and you tried not to yank too hard before you understood what it was attached to. The thread had started 2 months ago in a territorial land office 300 miles south, where a deputy clerk named Morrow had shown him records that didn't add up. Mining claim transfers that moved too fast. Accident reports that were filed before the accidents happened. One name that appeared on every document like a signature on a painting. Not always visible, but always there when you knew where to look. Victor Harrow. Elias didn't come to Blackstone Hollow because someone sent him. He came because he had a habit, developed over 15 years of moving through places like this, of being unable to leave a crooked thing alone. It wasn't righteousness. He wasn't built for righteousness. It was something closer to irritation, the low, persistent kind that didn't go away when you ignored it, only got louder. He was 3/4 through his whiskey when the door opened and the third man walked in. This one was different from the other two. He was younger, broader through the shoulders, and he moved through the room with the kind of practiced casualness that told Elias immediately he had done this before, whatever this was. The man took a position near the center of the room, beside a support post, and leaned against it with his arms crossed like he was just resting his feet. Elias looked at the first two again. He recalculated the geometry. The man near the center had the clearest line to him. The man by the far wall could cut off any movement toward the back. The man nearest the door had already angled himself so that leaving would require walking directly past him. It was a clean setup. Whoever had planned it knew what they were doing. Elias took another sip and felt something cold and clarifying move through his chest. It was not fear exactly. He had been afraid enough times in his life to know what it felt like, and this wasn't quite it. This was more like the feeling you got when a complicated problem finally resolved itself into something simple and manageable. 3 men. A room with 11 other people who would scatter the moment anything started. 1 exit that was semi-controlled. 1 more that wasn't being watched because they didn't know he'd already found it. He set his glass down on the bar very carefully, the way you set something down when you're not in a hurry and you want everyone to know it. Denton noticed. His eyes finally came up. "You want another?" he asked. "Not yet," Elias said. "I'll finish this one first." He said it quietly, not for the room to hear. But the room heard it anyway, because rooms like that one had a way of going very still when something was about to happen, like the air itself was holding its breath. A miner 2 stools down picked up his glass and moved it 6 inches to the left, which was instinct, getting his hands away from the space between himself and whatever was coming. The card dealer kept dealing. That was interesting. Either he was oblivious, which Elias doubted, or he had been in enough of these rooms to know that keeping your hands visible and your movements regular was the safest thing you could do. The man at the center post shifted his weight. Small movement, almost nothing. But Elias caught it. He thought about Nathan Cole. He hadn't met the man yet, only knew him from a letter that had been written to the Territorial Land Authority and never properly answered. A letter from a miner who said he had found something, who said he could prove what was happening in Blackstone Hollow, who had then apparently gone very quiet. The letter had been sitting in a file that nobody was supposed to see. Elias had a way of seeing files nobody was supposed to see. He'd had that skill a long time. Nathan Cole was still alive. He'd confirmed that through careful, roundabout inquiry before he'd even reached the town limits. But the man was frightened. That was also in the letter, between the lines, in the way someone writes when they're trying to be precise and careful and are discovering that precision and care are very expensive in certain situations. Elias finished his whiskey. He set the glass down. Empty. He had one rule about things like this, and it wasn't about bravado or making a point. It was about clarity. You didn't walk into a hard thing still carrying something unfinished. You cleared your hands, cleared your head, and then you dealt with what was in front of you. The glass was empty. He turned around. The man at the center post had straightened up. The man by the far wall had moved half a step forward. The one near the door had his right hand loose at his side, fingers open, the way a hand looks when it's a half second from being closed around something. Elias looked at the one in the center because that was the one who mattered most. He was the coordinator. You could see it in the way the other 2 glanced at him fractionally, checking for a signal they hadn't received yet. "You're going to want to think about what happens next," Elias said. He said it quietly, conversationally, the way you might comment on the weather. Not loud enough to be a performance, just loud enough for the 3 of them. The center man's eyes narrowed. "Don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," Elias said. "And so does whoever sent you. Tell me something." He tilted his head slightly. "Did he tell you what I do for a living, or did he just give you a name and a location?" No answer. Which was an answer. "That's the problem with men like him," Elias said. "They know the value of information when it benefits them. They're very selective about sharing it." The man near the door made the first move. He was fast, faster than most, and he'd clearly been told that speed was the thing that settled these situations before they could get complicated. He was right about speed. He was wrong about Elias. What happened in the next several seconds was not graceful. It was not the kind of thing that looked the way it does in stories. Elias had taken a hit. He knew it immediately, a sharp pressure along his left side that would turn into a bruise the color of a storm sky by morning. But by the time the room registered that movement had happened at all, the man near the door was against the wall and not getting up under his own power. The man at the far wall reconsidered loudly. The man at the center went for his gun and found that Elias's hand was already there, not on his own weapon, but on the man's wrist, pressing a specific point with a specific amount of force that sent the hand open and useless. "Don't," Elias said. Not loud, not angry, just the word. The man stopped. For a moment, nobody in the room breathed. Then the card dealer set down his deck, slowly. And that small, deliberate sound, cards on felt, broke whatever had been holding the room suspended, and the miners and the women and the bartender all slowly reoriented themselves to a world that was still intact. Elias released the center man's wrist. He stepped back. He straightened his coat. "You're going to walk out of here," he said to the man still standing. "And you're going to tell whoever sent you that the message was received, and then you're going to think very carefully about whether the amount of money you're being paid is worth what comes next." The man looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the man on the floor by the door, who was breathing but not moving. Then he looked at Elias again. "Who are you?" he asked. Elias picked up his empty glass from the bar, looked at it, and set it back down. "Nobody you want to have sent here," he said. The man left. Denton stared at the bar counter. He had his hands flat on the wood, and he was staring at them like they were a map he was trying to read. After a while, he said, without looking up, "You should know that man works for Victor Harrow." "I know," Elias said, "and you should know that Victor Harrow owns this town." "I know that too." Denton finally looked up. He had the eyes of someone who had seen a lot of wrong things done in that room and had long ago made peace with the fact that he couldn't stop any of them. But there was something working behind those eyes now. Something old and cautious, like a lamp that had been turned down so low for so long that you'd almost forgotten it was still on. "Then you should know," he said, carefully, "that he's not going to stop." Elias looked at him. "Neither am I," he said. He asked Denton for a second whiskey. This time he paid for both. The room began to breathe again, unevenly, like a man who's been underwater longer than he intended. The card dealer picked up his deck. The miners came back to their drinks. Nobody spoke about what had happened, which was the custom in Blackstone Hollow, where speaking about things openly had a way of making those things worse. But they had all seen it. Every person in that room had seen a man finish his drink before turning to face 3 men who came to kill him. And in a town where fear had been the currency for 6 years, where you paid with it every morning just to keep what you had, that was not a small thing. That was a very specific kind of thing, the kind that traveled. Elias sat with his second whiskey and thought about Nathan Cole, somewhere up in the mountain claim with whatever evidence he'd gathered, alone and frightened and very probably running out of time. He thought about the land records and the falsified accident reports, and the name that appeared on everything like a watermark in a document you couldn't quite make out unless you held it to the light. He thought about the man who had just walked out of the saloon and the message he was carrying back. Harrow would know by midnight, maybe sooner. Elias had been in places like Blackstone Hollow before, towns where one man's grip had closed so tightly and for so long that the people inside had stopped imagining anything different, where the corruption wasn't just in the powerful man at the top, but in the way it had spread downward through every institution, every small official, every person who had made one pragmatic choice, and then another, until they couldn't quite see back to where they'd started. He had never found these places to be beyond reach, but he had also never found them to be easy. He finished his second whiskey. He thought, "You're going to need help in this town, and you're going to need to move before Harrow figures out how much trouble you actually are." He left a coin on the bar, picked up his saddlebags, and walked out of the Dust River Saloon into the dark street. Above him, the sky was enormous and uncompromising, the way skies out here always were, too big for the landscape beneath them, indifferent to everything happening in it. The stars were hard and cold and very far away. Elias pulled his coat tighter against the mountain air and walked toward the only room he could afford in a town where everything already belonged to one man. Tomorrow, he would find Nathan Cole. Tonight, he needed to think, and he had learned a long time ago that thinking was best done in a place where nobody could see your face while you did it. The room Elias rented was at the back of a boarding house run by a woman named Clara Finch, who charged $2 a week and asked no questions, which was the only arrangement Elias would have accepted anyway. The room itself was small enough that a man with long arms could touch both walls without fully extending them. There was a cot with a wool blanket that had been washed so many times it had achieved a state somewhere between fabric and suggestion. A wash basin. A window that faced the alley, which was good, not for the view, but because anyone coming through the front door would not know immediately where he was, and because a man who had spent 15 years in situations that required exits had long ago made a habit of counting them before he unpacked anything. He didn't undress. He sat on the edge of the cot and pressed 2 fingers against his left side and breathed through his nose when the pressure found the bruise that had been building there since the saloon. It was deeper than he'd first thought. Not broken, but close enough to make breathing interesting for the next few days. He'd had worse. He'd had worse in the last year alone. That wasn't reassurance so much as inventory. He pulled the land records from his saddlebag. Copies. The originals were somewhere safe, which was a location Elias kept inside his own head and nowhere else. He spread them on the cot and sat with the lamp turned low and went through them again, not because he'd forgotten anything, but because going through evidence in a new place sometimes showed you things you'd missed when you read it in the place you first found it. Context changed what you saw. He'd learned that early. The pattern was cleaner now that he was in the town itself. You could see it the way you could see the shape of a mountain better from a distance than from its base. Harrow's operation had been running for at least 6 years, probably longer, and it had been designed by someone who understood that the most durable kind of theft was the kind that looked, on paper, entirely legal. The mining claim transfers were all properly filed. The accident reports were all signed by the right people. Every document existed that should exist, and every document said what it needed to say. The problem was the timing. Elias had found 4 incidents in the records where the paperwork preceded the event by anywhere from 2 to 9 days. Not by much. Just enough that if you were moving fast through a stack of files, you'd never catch it. You had to be looking for exactly that thing in exactly the right way to see it. Nathan Cole had apparently been looking for exactly that thing. Elias folded the records back into the bag and lay down on the cot without removing his boots. The bruise throbbed. He stared at the ceiling, which had a water stain in the shape of something that wasn't quite anything, and thought about a man up on a mountain claim sitting with information that could destroy Victor Harrow's entire empire, alone, in the dark, waiting to see if anyone was coming. He thought, tomorrow, first light. He was asleep in 4 minutes. It was not restful sleep, but it was the kind of sleep a man learns to take when he can. Because there are times when rest is a luxury and times when it's a tactical necessity, and he had gotten old enough to know the difference. The morning came in gray and cold, as mornings did in the mountains, without asking anyone's opinion about it. Elias was already at the livery before the town was properly awake. Saddling a horse he'd arranged the evening before. A compact bay mare with a sensible disposition and enough mountain experience to navigate the trail he'd been told led up to the higher claims. The liveryman, a teenager with sleep still heavy in his eyes, leaned against the stall door and watched him without speaking, which Elias appreciated. He was 2 miles out of town when he heard the rider behind him. Not close, far enough back that it might have been coincidence, might have been a miner heading to his own claim, might have been nothing. But Elias had been in enough situations to know that might and were very different words, and he spent the next half-mile testing the gap between them. He slowed. The rider slowed. He took a side trail for 50 yards and came back to the main path. The rider did the same. Not coincidence. Elias stopped his horse in a spot where the trail bent around a rock formation large enough to break the sight line and waited with his hand resting on his thigh. Not on his weapon, but near enough. When the rider came around the bend and found him sitting there, already looking at him, the man pulled up short, and his horse danced sideways. He was not one of Harrow's men. Elias registered that in the first second. Wrong posture, wrong clothing, wrong kind of nervous. Harrow's men carried their fear like armor, tucked behind aggression. This man was simply frightened, openly and without pretense, the way ordinary people were frightened when they were doing something that scared them, but felt necessary. He was maybe 40, with a working man's hands and a face that had been weathered past its years by outdoor labor. He had a rifle in a saddle scabbard that he hadn't reached for, which told Elias something important. "You're the man from the saloon," the writer said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Elias said. "Word travels fast in Blackstone Hollow." "I imagine it does." The man shifted in his saddle. His horse was still nervous from being startled, and he steadied it with an absent, practiced hand. "I'm not with Harrow. I want you to know that first." "All right," Elias said. "My name is Gideon Marsh. I work the Redtail claim, 2 miles below Nathan Cole's parcel." He paused. "Nathan is my neighbor. Has been for 4 years." Elias watched him. "Go ahead." "He sent word to me 2 days ago. Just a note, passed through the supply runner. It said if a stranger came to town asking about land records, I should find him and bring him up myself." Marsh looked uncomfortable. "I didn't know what to make of it, but after what happened at the saloon last night..." He stopped, shook his head. "There's no telegraph in this town that Harrow doesn't have a man watching. I figured the trail was safer." Elias considered this for a moment. It had the texture of truth, the specific, unglamorous texture of a man doing something that made him nervous because someone he trusted had asked him to. But texture wasn't certainty. "How do I know you're not bringing me somewhere for Harrow's benefit?" Elias said. Marsh met his eyes. "You don't," he said. "But Nathan said you'd ask that, and he said to tell you the timing on document 4 is 8 days, not 2. Elias went still. That was information that didn't exist anywhere except in the records he'd been carrying and in his own head. Nobody else had seen those documents, which meant Nathan Cole had found the same discrepancy, possibly the same document, through his own research, independently. "Lead the way," Elias said. The trail climbed steeply once they left the main path, and the mare picked her way up it with the kind of focused, no-nonsense attitude Elias had appreciated in her from the start. Marsh rode ahead and didn't talk, which suited them both. The mountain was loud enough in its own way. Wind through the pines, the distant complaint of a creek running somewhere below the trail, the occasional dislodged stone skittering down the slope. Nathan Cole's claim was not impressive from the outside. That was probably intentional. There was a cabin that leaned slightly to the left, a hand-dug shaft with a wooden collar around its mouth, and a small equipment shed that had weathered so many seasons it was more gray than any color it had originally been. A man could ride past this claim and see nothing worth stopping for, which was, Elias suspected, precisely the point. Cole came out of the cabin before they dismounted. He was younger than the letter had suggested, maybe 32, 33, with the kind of lean that came from working hard and eating enough, but never quite enough. He had dark circles under his eyes that told Elias he hadn't slept properly in days, possibly longer. He looked at Elias the way a man looks at a door he's been waiting a long time to see open, with an expression that was equal parts relief and continued terror, because hope and fear were not mutually exclusive emotions, and Nathan Cole was experiencing both of them at the same time. "You found the documents," he said. Not a greeting, just the most important thing. "I did," Elias said. "Document 4, 8 days." Cole let out a breath that had clearly been held for some time. "Come inside," he said. "I need to show you what else I have." What Nathan Cole had was, to put it plainly, remarkable. Elias had been in the business of finding buried things for a long time, and he had developed a working respect for what it took: the patience, the attention, the willingness to follow something through corners that looked like dead ends. Cole had done something that a trained investigator would have been proud of, and he'd done it alone, while working a mining claim, while living in a town where the man he was building a case against controlled nearly every institution. He had 3 years of records. Some stolen, Cole was honest about that, without apology, from the assay office and the land records building during off hours, when the clerks who worked for Harrow were not present. Some gathered through his own observation, written in a small notebook in a handwriting so cramped and precise, it looked like it had been made under pressure, which it had been. Some were statements, not signed, not official, but written down, from other miners who had experienced things they couldn't explain, whose claims had transferred to Harrow's holdings under circumstances that never quite made sense to them, but that they'd been too frightened to challenge. The picture that emerged from all of it was uglier than what Elias had pieced together from the territorial records alone. Harrow wasn't just falsifying documents and acquiring land. He had been engineering accidents. Not every accident, but enough. And with sufficient precision that the rate of serious incidents in the mines he operated directly was more than 3 times the regional average, while the incidents in mines he'd acquired from the estates of dead or departed miners were concentrated in a very specific pattern that pointed toward deliberate sabotage of equipment. Men had died. Cole had names. He had dates. He had statements from family members who had accepted Harrow's compensation payments and signed documents they hadn't fully understood, and who had then found those documents used against them in subsequent land proceedings. Elias read through everything twice. Cole sat across the table and watched him with the tight, exhausted patience of someone who had lived with this information for too long and needed someone else to carry part of its weight. "You understand what you have here," Elias said. It wasn't a question. "I understand enough," Cole said. "I also understand that understanding it and doing something with it are 2 entirely different problems." "They are," Elias agreed. "The territorial authority is 3 days' ride. The nearest federal circuit judge is further, and Harrow has men watching every road out of this valley that matters." Cole's jaw tightened. "Last month, a man named Perkins tried to take a complaint to the county seat. He made it 14 miles before his horse came back without him." Elias looked at him. "They said it was a riding accident," Cole said flatly. "Nobody believed it. Nobody said so out loud." The silence in the cabin had a weight to it. Outside, the wind had picked up against the walls, and the leaning corner of the structure made a low, occasional sound that might have been structural complaint or just the mountain talking to itself. "Who else knows you have this?" Elias said. "Gideon knows I have something. He doesn't know the details. And there's one person in town—" Cole stopped. He was deciding something. "The marshal's wife, Margaret Rhodes. She used to keep books for the assay office before Harrow replaced the staff 4 years ago. She understood what the numbers meant before I did. She's the one who pointed me toward document 4. Elias sat back in his chair. This changed some things. "The marshal," he said carefully, "Caleb Rhodes, is not his wife," Cole said. "Margaret is— she's a different person than her husband. She married him before Harrow's hold on this town was what it is now. She stayed because leaving would raise questions she can't answer safely." He paused. "She's been careful, very careful, but she hates what she's watched happen here, and she's been waiting for something to change." "Does Harrow know about her involvement?" "I don't think so. She's been meticulous about it." Cole's voice dropped slightly. "Which is the only reason she's still safe." Elias turned this over. A marshal who was compromised. A marshal's wife who was quietly building the other side of the same case. An independent miner with 3 years of documentation and nowhere to safely send it. "The evidence needs to move," Elias said. "It can't stay here. Harrow sent 3 men to the saloon last night, which means he knows someone is asking questions. He'll be moving faster now. Whatever his timeline was before last night, it's compressed." Cole's expression didn't change, but something in it tightened. "How do we move it without it being intercepted?" "The road routes are watched," you said. "What about the railroad spur, the one that runs to the Millhaven Junction?" Cole shook his head slowly. "Harrow owns 2 of the 3 men who work that transfer station." "Who's the third?" A pause. "Man named Aldous Greer. He's been there 15 years. He's not Harrow's, but he's not anybody's either. He keeps his head down." "Men who keep their heads down are still men," Elias said. "What does he care about?" Cole thought about this. "His granddaughter, she's been sick. He's been trying to get her to a proper doctor in the city for 6 months, but the cost—" "That's enough," Elias said. He wasn't offering a transaction. He was identifying a leverage point of a different kind. Not fear, not money, but the thing that makes a man who has spent years carefully keeping himself out of other people's problems finally decide that a particular problem is worth entering. Everyone had one. It was rarely the large abstract thing. It was usually something small and specific and immediate, like a sick child, or a promise made to someone who trusted you, or a particular cruelty you witnessed on a particular day that went 1 inch past everything you'd been able to ignore before it. Gideon Marsh, who had been leaning against the wall and listening with the look of a man who had agreed to more than he'd initially understood, cleared his throat. "You're talking about moving the evidence through Greer." "I'm talking about having a conversation with Greer," Elias said. "Which is different. I don't make promises on other people's behalf." "And if he says no?" Elias looked at the stack of documents on the table. 3 years of one man's work. Names of dead miners. Families who'd signed things they didn't understand. A pattern of engineered harm going back to the beginning of Victor Harrow's hold on the valley. Then we find another way, he said, but I want to talk to him first. They spent 2 more hours in the cabin, organizing the evidence, making decisions about what to copy and what to send in the original and how to divide it so that no single interception would destroy the entire case. Cole worked with this precision of someone who had been thinking about this problem for a long time and had already gamed out most of the scenarios. He was not what Elias had expected, not a frightened man paralyzed by his own information, but someone who had passed through that stage months ago and arrived at a grimmer and more functional place on the other side. He was scared, yes, but fear had become his ambient condition, and he had learned to operate inside it the way a man learns to work in poor light, carefully, slowly, with a lot of attention to what his hands were doing. Elias found himself respecting him without making a production of it. It was early afternoon when they heard the horses. Not 1 or 2, more than that. Coming up the trail with no attempt at quiet, which was either confidence or a statement. "We are not concerned about whether you hear us." Cole went pale. Marsh moved to the window and looked through the gap in the shutter. He held up 4 fingers, then reconsidered and held up 5. Elias was already thinking about the shed, the shaft opening, the angle of the hillside behind the cabin. He was also thinking about the copies, which were not yet complete. "How long to finish copying the most critical documents?" he said quietly. Cole looked at the table. 20 minutes. Maybe 15 if... "You have 10, Elias said. "Go." He looked at Marsh. "Is there another way down from this claim?" "Not the main trail." Marsh hesitated. The hesitation of a man who knew there was and was calculating what it meant that Elias was asking. "There's a game path. Goes east, comes out near the creek. It's rough." "How rough?" "Rough enough that men who don't know it make mistakes on it." "Do you know it?" "Every inch," Marsh said quietly. "Then that's where we're going," Elias said, "as soon as Cole is done." Outside, the horses had stopped. There was a sound of boots on ground, the low murmur of voices giving instructions, the mechanical sounds of preparation that Elias had heard enough times to read without needing to see the source. They were surrounding the cabin, methodically. This was not the same as last night's setup at the saloon. That had been 3 men improvising under instruction. This was organized, and the organization reflected someone who had reconsidered the problem after the first attempt failed and arrived at a more serious answer. Cole's hand was moving fast across the page, his breathing audible, his penmanship suffering but still legible. He knew what mattered most and was doing it first, which was smart. Elias watched the door and the window and monitored the sounds outside and thought about 3 things simultaneously, which was a habit he'd developed not because he was exceptional, but because he'd been forced to develop it in order to stay alive. The first thing was the men outside and how many and how they were positioned. The second was the game path, and how long it would take to reach it from the cabin's back corner and how much of a head start they would need. The third was Victor Harrow, sitting somewhere in this town, in his mining office, in his house, in whatever room he used when he was making decisions, recalculating. Last night, he had sent 3 men to quietly handle a problem. Today, he had sent 5 to surround a mountain claim in the middle of the day. That escalation said something about his confidence level, and it said something about his timeline, and it said something about how afraid he was, which in turn said something about how much he understood the threat to be real. A man who was truly in control didn't send 5 men up a mountain in daylight. He sent them at night, quietly, and made sure nobody connected the outcome to his name. Victor Harrow was beginning to make the kinds of decisions that frightened men made, and frightened men in his position were dangerous in a specific way. Not the calculating danger of someone working a plan, but the volatile danger of someone compressing their options. "Done," Cole said. He had the copies folded and tucked inside an oilskin pouch that he'd clearly prepared for exactly this scenario, which told Elias that he'd been living with the expectation of this moment for some time and had made his own preparations, quietly, alone. Elias took the originals. Cole kept the copies. Divide the risk, divide the liability. "Marsh," Elias said. "I know," Marsh said. He was already moving toward the back. They went out through a gap in the rear wall that had been cut to look like weather damage, a section of boards that swung outward on hidden hinges, low enough that you had to duck, opening onto the steep slope behind the cabin. Cole went through first, Marsh second, Elias last, pulling the boards back into place behind him with care, making sure from the outside it looked like nothing had moved. The voices at the front of the cabin were louder now. Someone was calling out, an instruction, a warning, something with authority in it that expected compliance. Elias didn't stop to listen to the specific words. He followed Marsh onto the game path, which was exactly as rough as advertised. It was not a path in any comfortable sense of the word. It was a series of decisions made by animals following water and shelter, running along a grade that no one had ever improved with tools or intent. The footing was loose in places, solid in others, and the difference between the two was not always obvious until you were already committed to a step. Marsh moved through it with the certainty of long familiarity, choosing his steps without hesitation, not looking down but trusting his feet. Cole moved carefully, more carefully than they had time for, but he was managing. Elias moved at the back and watched behind them and listened for the sound of pursuit. It came. Not immediately. It took the men outside time to understand that the cabin was empty, and a little more time to find the back exit, and more time still to assess the slope and decide whether to follow or to cut around. By the time they heard boots on rock behind them, Marsh had led them through the worst of the grade and onto a more navigable stretch that ran roughly east along the mountainside, descending gradually toward the sound of the creek. "How far?" Elias said quietly. "Another mile to the creek crossing," Marsh said, not breaking stride. "Once we're across, there's a mine road that connects to the Millhaven Junction route. Comes out about a mile north of the station." Cole stumbled on a loose section and caught himself against the hillside with one hand tearing the palm. He kept moving. Elias noted the injury and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. It hurt, it was bleeding, it would be dealt with later, and Cole already knew all of that. The sounds of pursuit faded. Either the men behind them had lost the trail, or they'd made the calculation that 5 men crashing through rough terrain after 3 who knew the path was a bad return on the effort, and had chosen to report back and redirect. Neither option was comfort exactly. Reporting back meant Harrow would know they'd moved. Redirecting meant people being placed on the roads ahead. The creek appeared below them, running fast with late-season snowmelt, clear and very cold. The crossing was a series of stones that Marsh navigated with the ease of habit, and they reached the far bank in under 2 minutes, all of them wet below the knee from a misstep that the rocks had not forgiven. Elias looked at Cole, who was breathing hard but upright, oilskin pouch pressed against his chest with both arms. "The copies are intact?" Elias said. Cole looked down at the pouch. "Yes." "Good," Elias said. He turned to Marsh. "Lead us to the road." The mine road was wide enough for a wagon, rutted from heavy use, and smelled of iron ore, and the particular kind of dust that only exists around extracted earth. They moved along its edge rather than its center, harder to see from a distance, more uncomfortable to walk, marginally safer. Marsh said, after a while, "Greer works the afternoon shift at the junction, usually alone after 2 o'clock. Elias looked at the sky, reading the light. It was past 1. They had time, barely, and only if nothing else went wrong between here and the station. He thought about Margaret Rhodes, the marshal's wife, somewhere in Blackstone Hollow, right now going about whatever her day required with the careful, unremarkable surface of a woman who had been practicing ordinary for 4 years. He thought about what she knew and what she'd been willing to do with it, and what the cost would be if Harrow ever understood the role she'd played. He thought about Caleb Rhodes, the marshal, who had been making his own calculations for 6 years, living inside a compromise so long it had become his normal, losing pieces of himself one pragmatic choice at a time until he might not be able to find the edge of who he'd been before all of it started. Elias had known men like that. Some of them found their way back. Some of them didn't. He didn't know yet which kind Rhodes was. What he knew was that the evidence in the oilskin pouch and the originals distributed through his own saddlebag represented, for the first time in 6 years, a material threat to Victor Harrow's control of Blackstone Hollow. Not a rumor, not a grievance, documentation. The kind that could travel to a territorial court and survive scrutiny and make the case without the presence of any living witness to sustain it. That made the next few hours the most dangerous of the entire situation, because Harrow didn't know exactly what they had, but he knew they had something. And a man who had built an empire on paperwork understood better than most the specific danger of paper that could be read by someone with authority to act on it. The junction station appeared ahead through the trees, small and functional, with a water tower, a freight platform, and the iron smell of the rail line running east toward the wider world. Elias touched Marsh's arm. "Wait here with Cole," he said. "Let me go in first." "What if Greer isn't alone?" Marsh said. "Then I adjust," Elias said. He straightened his coat, a habitual thing, not vanity, the way you settle yourself before walking into something, and walked toward the station door with the evidence for Victor Harrow's destruction tucked against his ribs, and a bruise on his left side that was making itself increasingly difficult to ignore. The door opened before he reached it. A man stood in the doorway, older, with the squinting look of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors reading distances. He looked at Elias with the flat, measuring expression of a man who had learned not to trust arrivals he wasn't expecting. "Help you?" Aldous Greer said. Elias looked at him. "I hope so," he said. "I need to talk to you about getting something out of this valley, and I need you to understand why it matters before you tell me no." Greer studied him. The wind off the mountain moved between them, cold and without opinion. "Better come inside then," Greer said after a moment. "But make it fast. The afternoon train doesn't wait on conversations." Aldous Greer's station office was about the size of a generous closet, with a desk that had been buried under paper for so long. The paper had become structural, and a wood stove in the corner that was working hard against the mountain cold and mostly winning. There were 2 chairs, both occupied by stacks of freight manifests, which Greer moved to the floor without ceremony before gesturing for Elias to sit. He didn't sit himself. He stood with his back to the stove and his arms crossed, and looked at Elias the way a man looks at something he's trying to decide the weight of before he picks it up. "You've got about 12 minutes before the afternoon freight comes through," Greer said. "After that, I'll be occupied for 30. So whatever you have to say it like you mean it." Elias said it like he meant it. He laid out the situation in the way he'd learned was most effective with men like Greer. Not from the beginning, not with context or build-up, or the kind of framing that asked a person to trust you before you'd given them a reason to. He started with the specific, the falsified documents, the timed accidents, the names of miners who had died in incidents that the paperwork had predicted. He watched Greer's face while he talked and read what moved across it, which was not surprised that was important, but rather the grim, slow recognition of a man hearing a shape confirmed that he'd already been carrying as a suspicion. When Elias finished, Greer was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere down the line, the distant sound of a train was beginning to build in the way that train sounds did, starting as something you felt in your back teeth before you heard it properly. "The Hendricks accident," Greer said finally. 3 years ago. 2 men dead in the number 4 shaft. Everyone said it was a support failure. The report was filed 6 days before it happened, Elias said, with the cause already listed. Greer's jaw tightened. "I knew Ed Hendricks," he said. "Worked with him for a season before he went to Harrow's mine." He looked at the wall. His wife took the compensation payment. She had 4 children and no income, and Harrow's lawyer came to her door 3 days after the funeral. What was she supposed to do? It wasn't a question. "Nothing," Elias said. "She did the only thing she could do. That's how it was designed." The train sound was getting louder. Greer straightened up and looked at Elias with an expression that had resolved itself from its earlier ambivalence into something harder and quieter. "What do you need?" he said. "A package on the afternoon eastbound," Elias said. "No name on the sender. Addressed to the Territorial Circuit Judge's office at Mill Haven. I need it to arrive without being logged in your station manifest." Greer's expression didn't change. "That's against procedure." "It is," Elias agreed. "And if it's discovered that then I'll stand in front of whoever asks and tell them it was done on my instruction, which is true." Elias paused. "But I need you to understand that if this package doesn't move today, the window closes. Harrow already knows someone came to this valley with questions. By tomorrow, he'll have enough of the picture to start destroying whatever he can reach. These documents need to be in a place he can't reach." The train sound had become a physical thing, moving through the floor and up through the chair legs, and Greer turned toward the window for a moment, not looking at the approaching freight, but at something past it, some internal calculation that was almost visible on his face. "My granddaughter," he said. "Her name is Clara. She's 7 years old and she has been sick since the spring, and I have been trying to get her to a proper doctor in the city for 6 months, and every time I get close to having enough, something else takes the money." He turned back to Elias. "I'm not telling you this so you'll offer me something. I'm telling you because I want you to understand that I am a man who has been watching this valley go wrong for 6 years and doing nothing about it, because I had something more important than justice to protect." Elias looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking you to stop protecting her," he said. "I'm asking you to do one thing that helps the case and doesn't put you in its center. Nobody needs to know you did this. Nobody I work with will say your name." Greer was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he held out his hand. Elias gave him the package, the originals, wrapped in oilskin, sealed with wax, addressed in a hand that was not his own, because Cole had written the address before they left the mountain, anticipating this moment. Greer took it with both hands and looked at it for a moment, the way you look at something you've just committed to carrying. The freight train arrived with the full, indifferent authority of machinery that didn't care what decisions were being made around it. By the time it left, the package was no longer in Greer's hands. Elias found Marsh and Cole where he'd left them, in the tree line 30 yards back from the station. Cole sitting on a flat rock with his torn palm wrapped in a strip of cloth that Marsh had cut from the bottom of his own shirt. Cole looked up when he saw Elias's face, reading it the way people read faces when they've been waiting for news and are too tired to pretend they're not. "It's on the train," Elias said. Cole closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them and said, "How long until it reaches Mill Haven?" "Eastbound makes the junction by nightfall," Marsh said. "Maybe 10 o'clock. "And then someone has to actually read it," Cole said. His voice had the flat quality of a man who had learned not to let himself feel relieved until relief was genuinely warranted. "And decide to act on it. And find a way to act on it that gets past Harrow's connections in the county offices." "One problem at a time," Elias said. "The documents are moving. That changes the situation." He meant it, but he also knew Cole was right to keep his expectations measured. Sending the evidence was necessary. It was not sufficient. The package reaching Mill Haven would set something in motion, but the machinery of territorial authority moved at its own speed, which was not the speed of a man who had just sent 5 riders up a mountain and found an empty cabin. Harrow's timeline and the court's timeline were not the same timeline, and the gap between them was exactly the space in which things could go wrong in ways that paper couldn't prevent. They needed more than the documents moving. They needed the town to hold. Elias said this, in those words, on the walk back down the mine road toward the lower valley, and Marsh looked at him sideways with the expression of a man who understood the words but was working out what they meant in practice. "Hold how?" Marsh said. "The miners who gave Cole their statements," Elias said, "the ones who knew something was wrong and wrote it down. How many of them are still in the valley?" "Most," Cole said. "They've got nowhere else to go. Their claims are here, what's left of them. Their families. And if someone stood up in this town and said publicly what you've been saying privately for 3 years, what would happen?" Marsh made a short, humorless sound. "Last man who tried to say anything publicly about Harrow's operations ended up leaving the valley in a hurry. That was Declan Fossey 2 years ago. He was on the Miners' Cooperative Board. He raised questions about the accident rate at a public meeting. The next morning his equipment shed burned down, and the morning after that Harrow's lawyer appeared with a debt collection notice for a loan Fossey had taken against his claim 3 years prior, which he had almost finished paying." He paused. "Fossey was gone within a week." "So the mechanism is debt and fire," Elias said. "And the men Harrow keeps," Cole said quietly. "Not just gunmen. He has the bank manager, the supply merchant, the assay officer. He has the marshal." Cole said this last one with a particular flatness that was more painful than anger would have been. "If you stand up in this town and say the wrong thing, Harrow doesn't have to lay a hand on you. He just tightens the mechanisms. You can't get credit. You can't sell your ore. Your claim gets tied up in a legal dispute that goes on for 2 years and costs you everything you'd saved." He looked at Elias. "It's not a fist. It's a system. And people are afraid of systems they can't punch back at." They reached the lower valley as the afternoon light began its long mountain-specific decline, going from gold to gray in stages that were beautiful in the way that things were beautiful when you weren't in a position to appreciate them. The town appeared ahead, not welcoming, not threatening, just present, the way Blackstone Hollow always was, sitting in the valley with the mountains above it, and the mine shafts threading down into the earth below, and the whole weight of Victor Harrow's invisible architecture holding every part of it in its current shape. Elias stopped at the edge of the tree line. "I need to talk to Margaret Rhodes," he said. Cole looked at him sharply. "That's a risk. Everything from here forward is a risk. What I can't do is walk back into this town without understanding who I can use and who I can't. The marshal's wife has been working this from inside for 4 years. She knows things about the system that aren't in the documents." He paused. "And she may be the only person in Blackstone Hollow who can talk to Caleb Rhodes in a way he'll actually hear." "You're thinking about turning the marshal," Marsh said. It was not quite a question. "I'm thinking about giving him a reason to remember what his badge is for," Elias said, "which is different." The distinction seemed to matter to him, and Marsh let it go. They agreed that Cole would go back to Marsh's claim rather than his own, which was now a place Harrow's men knew and had already visited and would watch. That was not a perfect solution. There were no perfect solutions in what remained of this day. But it was better than returning Cole to a cabin that had been surrounded by 5 men less than 3 hours ago. Marsh would go with him. They would stay quiet, stay off the main trail, and wait. Elias went into town alone, which was how he did most things that mattered. He entered Blackstone Hollow from the south, coming in through the back of the residential streets rather than the main road, and moved through it the way he'd learned to move through towns that were watching for him. Not hurrying, not hiding, because both of those things drew attention in their own way, but simply walking with the purposeful, unremarkable pace of a man who knew where he was going and had a reason to be going there. He found Margaret Rhodes at the back of her own house, hanging laundry in the narrow yard that backed onto the alley. She was a spare, precise woman of maybe 45, with gray threaded through dark hair and the composed, careful expression of someone who had spent years managing what showed on her face. She saw him coming through the gate and did not startle, which told him something. She turned back to the laundry and continued what she was doing, which told him something more. "Don't stop what you're doing," Elias said, keeping his voice low and his position in the shadow of the fence line. "I'll talk. You decide whether to respond." Margaret pinned a shirt to the line. "Nathan is safe," she said, before he could say anything further. It was not a question. "For now," Elias said. "We moved the documents this afternoon. Eastbound train." Her hands paused for half a second on the next piece of laundry, then continued. "How much of it?" "The originals?" Cole kept copies, addressed to the circuit judge's office. "That's good," she said. Flat, precise. The voice of a woman who had learned to hold emotion in reserve for situations where expressing it was safe, which in Blackstone Hollow had become a very small category. "That's better than I hoped for." "I need to talk to you about your husband," Elias said. The laundry basket had one more item in it. She took it out, pinned it, and then turned and looked at him directly for the first time. She had careful eyes, not cold, but measured, the kind of eyes that had been doing a great deal of work quietly for a long time, and showed it in the way that people showed sustained effort without complaint, which was in the small lines around them rather than in the eyes themselves. "Caleb is not a bad man," she said. "I want you to understand that before anything else." "I'm not here to judge him," Elias said. "People always say that," she replied without bitterness. "What they mean is that they've already made their judgment and are being polite about it." She looked at him steadily. "My husband has made choices I couldn't have made. I know why he made them. I don't approve of them. Those things can be true at the same time." "They can," Elias said. "And they are. I've seen men in his position. Usually it starts with one choice that seems manageable and ends with a man who can't recognize the distance he's traveled." Something shifted in Margaret's expression. Not softening exactly, more like the specific reaction of someone hearing an accurate description of a painful thing. "The accident at the Henderson shaft," she said. 4 years ago. Before that, Caleb pushed back. He asked questions. He was not the marshal Harrow wanted him to be. She looked at the laundry line. "After the Henderson accident, Harrow sat down with him privately. I don't know what was said, but I know that something ended in that meeting and something else began. And the Caleb who walked out of it was more careful about which questions he asked in public." "What did Harrow have on him?" A long pause. The wind moved through the laundry, cold and unhurried. "A debt," she said finally, "from before we came to this valley. A business that failed. Caleb took money from a man he shouldn't have trusted, and when the business went under, he couldn't repay it. By the time we arrived here, it had been settled, or we thought it had. Harrow found the original note, bought it from the creditor, held it. She looked at Elias directly again. It was enough. Elias was quiet for a moment. If the evidence reaches the circuit judge, he said, and if an investigation begins, Harrow's leverage over your husband becomes considerably less valuable. A man facing federal scrutiny has less capacity to collect private debts. I know that, she said, which means the window for your husband to make a different choice is between now and whenever Harrow realizes how far this has gone. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. The thing working behind her eyes was not simple. It was the specific complexity of a person who loves someone and has watched them make wrong choices and has lived with the weight of that and is now being told that an exit might exist, which was either hope or the cruelest possible form of disappointment, depending on what Caleb Rhodes did with it. He would need to hear it from you, she said finally. Not from me. He would dismiss it from me. Not because he doesn't trust me, but because… She stopped, chose the next words carefully. Because hearing it from me would make him feel judged, and a man who already judges himself harshly doesn't respond well to more of it. Where is he now? His office. He'll be there until 6. Elias looked at the sky. He had maybe 40 minutes. Tell me one thing, he said. If I walk into his office, what does he do? Margaret was quiet. Honestly, she said, I don't know. That's the truthful answer, and I wish I had a better one for you. I know who he was. I know who he's become. I don't know which one is still in there. Elias nodded. He had expected something like that. He left through the gate the same way he'd come in, and he walked through the back streets toward the marshal's office with the particular kind of focus that preceded things he couldn't fully plan for, which was the same focus he'd had in the saloon 2 nights ago, minus the glass of whiskey to organize himself around. The marshal's office was on the main street, between the land records building and the hardware merchant, which was either a deliberate placement, law adjacent to the documents that law was supposed to protect, or just an accident of the town's original layout, which was more likely. A light was on inside. Through the window, a shape moved. Elias went in without knocking. Not rudeness, calculation. A man who knocked gave the person inside time to arrange their face. Caleb Rhodes looked up from a desk covered in the particular kind of paperwork that accumulated in offices where the incumbent had learned to use documentation as a substitute for action. He was a heavy-built man in his 50s, with a gray mustache and the look of someone who had once been physically imposing and was now something softer, not from age exactly, but from the specific kind of erosion that came from years of making himself smaller than he was. He recognized Elias immediately. The recognition moved across his face quickly and was quickly controlled, but Elias had been watching for it. You're the man from the saloon, Rhodes said. I am, Elias said. He pulled the second chair to the front of the desk and sat down without being invited. I need about 10 minutes of your time. After that, you can do what you want with me. Rhodes looked at him with the careful, calibrated expression of a man who had spent 4 years learning to give nothing away in his first reaction. You're sitting in my office after being involved in a violent incident in this town 2 nights ago and asking for 10 minutes of my time. 3 men came to kill me in the Dust River Saloon, Elias said. You already know who sent them. I think you've known since the night it happened. Something happened in the marshal's face that was very small and very telling. Not guilt. Men like Rhodes had made peace with guilt by developing a more complicated vocabulary for it. More like the specific discomfort of having a thing said plainly that you'd been maintaining in a carefully complicated form. That's a serious accusation, Rhodes said. It's an accurate one, Elias said, and I think we both know that this conversation is going to go a lot better if we skip the part where you perform uncertainty. A long silence. Rhodes looked at him. Then he looked at the desk. Then he looked at the window. What do you want? He said. And in the question was the exhaustion of a man who had been waiting for a version of this conversation for a long time and was almost relieved it had arrived, even if he wasn't prepared to show that. Elias told him about the documents. Not all of it. Not Cole's identity, not the copies, not Marsh's involvement, but the core of it, what had been found, what it showed, where it was going. He watched Rhodes's face as he listened and saw things move through it that Rhodes was not entirely able to control. which was the face of a man receiving information that reorganized things he told himself were settled. When Elias finished, Rhodes said nothing for a moment. Then, "The Henderson accident is in the documents," Elias said. "The report was filed before it happened." Rhodes's right hand, resting on the desk, closed slowly into a fist and then opened again. "2 men died in that shaft," he said quietly. "Brothers. Darrell and Reed Pitson. Darrell was 26. Reed was 23. "I know," Elias said. "I went to Harrow after that. I told him what I thought." The fist closed again, opened. "He showed me the note, reminded me what it meant for my family if it was called in, and I—" He stopped. Elias waited. "I told myself it wasn't proof," Rhodes said. The words came out with the specific flatness of something that had been repeated internally many times, the way a lie becomes familiar from use, that my suspicions weren't evidence, that I could do more good in this position than outside of it. He looked at Elias. "I told myself a lot of things. You probably believed most of them at the time," Elias said. "Not unkindly, just accurately." "That's the problem with compromise," Rhodes said. "It makes sense at every individual step." He was quiet for a moment. "What happens when the circuit judge receives the documents?" "An investigation begins," Elias said. "A proper one, with territorial authority behind it. Harrow's operations go under scrutiny. The fraudulent transfers get reviewed. The accident records get examined by people who have the standing to act on them." "And Harrow's local leverage," Rhodes said. "His ability to enforce his position here in the valley becomes considerably less reliable when federal scrutiny is incoming," Elias said. "A man facing that kind of investigation has other priorities." Rhodes looked at him steadily. "You're telling me the note becomes less dangerous?" "I'm telling you that a man who is managing an investigation by territorial authorities into criminal fraud and wrongful death has significantly reduced capacity to call in private debts and manage their fallout," Elias said. "Which is not the same as the note disappearing, but the calculus changes." Another silence, longer this time. "What do you need from me?" Rhodes said. And in the asking of it, something had changed. Not dramatically, not with the kind of sudden moral clarity that stories sometimes imposed on moments like these, because that wasn't how it happened in actual people. It was smaller than that. It was the specific shift in a man who had been holding a position for a long time and had finally found a reason to stop holding it that he could accept. "Nothing tonight," Elias said. "Tonight I need you to know what's happening. Tomorrow, if Harrow moves the way I think he's going to move, I'm going to need the marshal of this town to remember that he has a badge for a reason." Rhodes looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "My wife," he said. "Does she know you're here?" "She told me where to find you," Elias said. Something crossed Caleb Rhodes's face that was complicated and old and not entirely readable. It was not surprise. It was something more like the particular grief of a man understanding, in a new and specific way, how much someone had been carrying on his behalf without ever asking him to account for it. He nodded once. Small. Almost nothing. Elias stood up and left the office. On the street, the evening had arrived with the mountain's characteristic abruptness, dark coming in fast from the east, while the west was still pale. The main street of Blackstone Hollow had its usual evening texture. The tail end of the work shift filtering through from the mines, men moving toward the saloon or toward their homes with the heavy, ground-down tiredness of people who labored for a living in someone else's enterprise. Elias watched them and thought about what Cole had said. It's not a fist. It's a system. And people are afraid of systems they can't punch back at. He went back to Clara Finch's boarding house and sat in his small room with the lamp low and his coat still on, and thought through the next several moves, the way you thought through a complicated problem when you were tired and your left side hurt, and you weren't certain you had all the information you needed. He did not have all the information he needed. He knew that. What he had was enough to work with, which was rarely the same thing, and was nonetheless what you were given. What he knew, the documents were on the eastbound train. The circuit judge's office would have them by morning at the latest. That was the foundation. What he knew, Harrow would discover the cabin was evacuated, and would know the documents had moved, and would begin calculating how much time he had before their arrival generated a response. Harrow was not stupid. He would understand that the documents alone were insufficient, that someone would need to testify, someone would need to stand behind them, and that destroying witnesses was still an option he had access to, which meant Cole was still in danger, which meant Marsh was in danger by association, which meant the next 12 to 24 hours were the most critical window of everything that had happened so far. Elias was still thinking through this when he heard the knock at his door. He was on his feet before the second knock, his hand near his weapon, his body at the side of the door frame rather than in front of it. "It's Finch," said a woman's voice from the other side. "There's someone asking for you at the front. A man. He's been standing outside for about 10 minutes, which is too long for someone who just wants to leave a message." Elias considered this. "What does he look like?" he said. "Older. Working man's clothes. He's got no weapon I can see, and he's holding his hat in his hands, which is the body language of a person who's nervous, not threatening." A pause. "That's my read anyway. I've been running this boarding house for 11 years and I've developed opinions." "Thank you," Elias said. "Tell him I'll be out in 2 minutes." He took 4. The man waiting on the front step of the boarding house was someone Elias didn't recognize, which was not remarkable. There were many people in Blackstone Hollow he hadn't met, but the man's face confirmed Clara Finch's read, nervous, deliberately non-threatening, hat rotating slowly in his hands. "You're Vane," the man said. "I am. My name is Doyle. I work the number 3 shaft at Harrow's main mine." He stopped, started again. "I've been working there for 5 years. I know what goes on in those shafts. Things I haven't said to anyone because—" He stopped again. His jaw was tight. "Because I have a wife and 2 boys and I know what happened to men who said things." Elias looked at him. "What changed?" Doyle met his eyes. "Word gets around in a mining town," he said, "about what happened at the saloon, about the fact that someone is asking questions and hasn't been stopped yet." He paused. "And this morning, Harrow's foreman told us that the number 3 shaft is going to have a maintenance inspection next week, which means it's being shut down for 2 days." He looked at Elias carefully. "Except I was working in that shaft last Tuesday. I know what the supports look like. There's nothing wrong with them." Elias went very still. "Say that again," he said. "The shaft doesn't need inspection," Doyle said. "The supports are fine. If they're shutting it down, it's not for inspection." He held Elias's eyes. "The last time they shut down a shaft for unexpected maintenance that wasn't needed, the Henderson shaft, 2 men went in afterward and didn't come out." The night was cold around them. From somewhere further up the main street, voices from the saloon, the sound of the town doing its ordinary evening things, unaware. Elias looked at this man, this miner who had come to a stranger's door holding his hat in his hands because the alternative was doing nothing, and thought about the specific kind of courage that looked nothing like courage from the outside. The kind that was just a person deciding, against all self-interest, that something mattered more than the calculation. "Who else works that shaft?" Elias said. 14 men regular," Doyle said. 2 who've been asking questions about the accident records. Harrow knows who they are." "Are they the ones he's worried about?" Doyle nodded, slowly. "I think so." Elias thought for 5 seconds about the implications and the timeline and what he had to work with and what he didn't. "Go home to your family tonight," he said. "Don't go back to that shaft tomorrow until you hear from me. If anyone asks, you're sick." Doyle looked at him. "And if I don't hear from you?" It was a fair question. It was the question a man asked when he was weighing the risk of trusting a stranger against the risk of continuing to trust a system that had already shown him what it did to people who trusted it too much. "Then the documents I sent to the circuit judge today will have to be enough on their own," Elias said. "But I intend for you to hear from me." Doyle put his hat back on his head. He nodded once, with the careful precision of someone committing to something they know they can't take back. He walked away into the dark of the street. Elias stood on the boarding house steps and looked up in at the mountains, which were massive and black against a sky that had a few hard stars starting to appear at its edges. He thought about the number 3 shaft. He thought about 2 men named Doyle had not said out loud, but that lived in the space between what he'd described and what it meant. Harrow preparing not just to protect his enterprise, but to remove specific people who had begun to look like problems. The documents were moving east on a train. The evidence was in motion. But Harrow was also in motion, and Harrow's motion was faster and more local and had the weight of 6 years of infrastructure behind it, and the space between those 2 timelines was exactly the space in which people could still get killed. Elias went back inside. He sat on the edge of the cot and pressed his hand against his left side and breathed carefully until the pain organized itself into something manageable. Then he thought through everything he knew and everything he still needed, and made the decisions that were available to him with the resources he actually had, which was different from the decisions he would have made with more time or more people or a better situation. He thought, tomorrow I walk into Harrow's building. Not because it was the safe choice. It was not close to the safe choice. It was the choice that made sense given that Harrow was going to move on the shaft, and that moving on the shaft meant moving faster than the court could act, and that the only thing that might slow Harrow's hand was a confrontation that made him understand the ground had already shifted beneath him, whether he could see it yet or not. You didn't go after a man like Victor Harrow with a gun. A gun solved the person without solving what the person had built, and what he'd built would simply find someone else to run it. You went after him with the truth, loudly enough and publicly enough that the people who had been sustaining him had to make a choice about whether they still wanted to. Elias had done this before, in other places, with mixed results. He had learned that outcomes depended on factors you couldn't always control: how frightened people were, how much they'd lost, whether the critical mass of exhausted compliance had been reached yet, or whether it needed one more push. Blackstone Hollow felt close to that edge. He had felt it in the saloon, in the way the room had watched him finish his whiskey, in Gideon Marsh's willingness to walk into the middle of someone else's trouble, in the miner named Doyle standing on a boarding house step with his hat in his hands, afraid in there anyway. He lay back on the cot. Tomorrow was going to be harder than today. That was, in his experience, usually how it went. Elias was awake before the light came. He lay on the cot in the small room at Clara Finch's boarding house and stared at the ceiling and listened to the mountain town coming to life in the dark, the movements of the livery, the distant sound of the mine bell calling the early shift, somewhere a dog that had opinions about the hour. He had slept maybe 3 hours in 2 separate stretches, and his left side had stiffened overnight into something that made sitting up a deliberate process requiring attention. He sat up. He breathed through it. He put his boots on. He had been in enough situations that required a clear head at an early hour to know that the preparation was as much mental as physical. You sorted through what you knew, what you didn't know, and what you were going to do about the gap between them. And you did it before the day started demanding things of you, because once it started demanding things, there was no more time for sorting. What he knew, the documents were in Millhaven or close to it. The circuit judge's office would have them by first light, possibly earlier if the freight ran on time. What happened next depended on who opened the package and what they did with what they found, which was the part of this he could not control and had to release. What he knew? Harrow had sent 5 men up the mountain yesterday and found an empty cabin. He knew the evidence had moved. He did not know yet where it had gone or how far, but he was a man who understood logistics, and he would be calculating options through the night, the same way Elias had, arriving at his own set of conclusions. The number 3 shaft maintenance shutdown was scheduled. Doyle had said next week, but Elias did not think next week was the real timeline anymore, not after yesterday. What he knew, Caleb Rhodes had heard things the night before that had unsettled the arrangement he'd been living inside. Whether that unsettling translated into action was still uncertain, and uncertainty about a man with a badge in a situation like this was a significant variable. What he knew, Gideon Marsh and Nathan Cole were at the Redtail claim, which was safer than Cole's own cabin, but not safe, because safe was not a condition that existed in Blackstone Hollow right now for anyone connected to what had happened. He washed his face in the basin. The water was cold from sitting overnight, and the shock of it was useful. He looked at himself in the small mirror above the basin and saw what he usually saw, a face that had accumulated more evidence of the years than he tended to think about, with a 2-day beard and eyes that were working despite the sleep debt behind them. He had a decision to make. He had made it already, on the cot the night before. But morning had a way of testing decisions made in the dark, and this one held up. He was going to walk into Victor Harrow's mining headquarters before the man had a chance to complete whatever calculation he was building. Not because it was safe, not because he was certain how it would end, but because the only thing that stopped a man like Harrow from moving on the next piece of what he was planning was forcing him to manage an immediate and visible crisis. And the most immediate and visible crisis Elias could create was himself, in Harrow's building, in front of witnesses, saying things that Harrow could not afford to have said. He picked up his coat and his saddlebag and went downstairs. Clara Finch was already in the kitchen. She was a compact, no-nonsense woman of 60 or so who had run her boarding house through 3 different eras of Blackstone Hollow's history and had survived each one by the simple method of keeping her own counsel and her prices fair. She looked at Elias when he appeared in her kitchen doorway and said nothing for a moment, only poured a second cup of coffee and set it on the table. He sat down and drank it without speaking, and she respected that. When he set the cup down, she said, "The man who was asking questions about you yesterday afternoon wasn't one of Harrow's regular people. He was someone from the bank." Elias looked at her. "You didn't mention that last night." "You had enough on your mind last night," she said practically. "And it wasn't urgent then. It might be now." She refilled her own cup. Harrow started asking the financial questions, which in my experience means he's building something. Building what? In this town. Usually a case for why a particular person shouldn't be trusted, why their debts are due, why their arrangements are no longer valid. She set the coffee pot down. He did it to the Fossey family 2 years ago. He did it to the widow Hendricks the year before that. It's how he moves people. She looked at Elias directly. "You don't have debts here and you don't have property, so he can't do it to you directly. But he can do it to people adjacent to you." The implication was clear, and she didn't need to say it more plainly than she had. "Nathan Cole," Elias said. "Cole has a claim loan through Harrow's bank," she said. "So does Gideon Marsh. Most miners in this valley do, because Harrow's bank is the only bank, and the terms were reasonable enough 6 years ago when most of them signed." She paused. "They're only reasonable until they're not." Elias set his coffee cup down carefully. This was new information, and it changed the texture of the morning's problem. Harrow didn't need to send men up the mountain again. He could simply call in Cole's loan and begin the legal process of seizing the claim, which under territorial law he could initiate in a matter of days, and which would give him a legitimate institutional mechanism for removing Cole from the valley and discrediting him simultaneously. It was elegant in the way that cruelty was sometimes elegant. Not a fist, a system. "How much does Cole owe?" Elias said. I don't know the specific amount," Claire said, "but I know his claim is productive enough that he's been making his payments. It's not the debt that's the weapon. It's the calling of it." Elias stood up. He picked up his coat. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "Just don't get anyone killed in my town." She said it quietly and meant it, and he understood that it was not entirely about him. The sun was barely over the eastern ridgeline when Elias walked up the main street of Blackstone Hollow toward the square 2-story building that housed Harrow Mining's administrative offices. It was the most substantial structure in town. Stone foundation, timber frame, a sign above the door that said Harrow Mining Company. In letters that had been painted recently enough to still be clean and legible, which was its own kind of statement in a town where most things had been weathered to their essential natures. I was aware of being watched from the moment he turned onto the main street. It was not a dramatic awareness. No one was pointing, no one moved to intercept him. But Blackstone Hollow was a town that had been living under close management for 6 years, and people who lived under close management developed a sensitivity to significant movement. Men on the street noted him and noted his direction, and the information passed through the town the way information passed in small places. Not quickly, but completely. He pushed the door open and went in. The front room was a clerk's office, with 2 desks and filing cabinets, and the smell of paper and ink, and the particular dusty, dry smell of buildings that contained a great deal of administrative activity. A young man at the near desk looked up from what he was doing and immediately made a decision about whether he was going to handle this himself, decided he was not, and stood up with the careful expression of someone trying to look more composed than they felt. "I need to see Harrow," Elias said. "Mr. Harrow is—" "Tell him the man from the saloon is here," Elias said. "He'll see me." The clerk went through the inner door. Elias stood in the front room and did not look around the way a person looked around when they were taking inventory, because he was taking inventory and didn't want it to be obvious. 2 windows, both facing the street. The inner door, which the clerk had gone through, and which led, from the building's layout, toward a back office. A staircase at the right side of the room going up to the 2nd floor, where he could hear footsteps moving. He was not alone in this building. He had not expected to be. The clerk came back. "He'll see you," he said, with the slightly stunned expression of a man whose prediction had been wrong. "Through here." Victor Harrow's office was large by the standards of Blackstone Hollow, and deliberately so, with a desk that would have been impressive in a territorial capital and a series of framed maps on the walls showing his mining claims in detail. Their boundaries, their access roads, their relationships to each other and to the rail line and to the town. There were at least 20 claims visible on those maps. Looking at them was looking at 6 years of systematic acquisition represented cartographically, which was clarifying in its own way. Harrow himself was standing behind the desk, not sitting, which was a choice. I was a man in his late 50s who had the physical solidity of someone who had worked with his body earlier in his life and now worked with his authority, which had its own weight. He was well dressed in the way that men who had money in places without much sophistication were well dressed, expensively, but not quite correctly, as though the clothing was performing a status that the person inside it was still partly performing themselves. His face was a controlled, angular face, with pale eyes that were doing a great deal of precise work behind a surface of careful composure. There were 2 other men in the room. They stood on either side of the office, positioned with the deliberateness of men who had been placed rather than who had chosen their positions. Both were armed. Both were trying to look like they were not specifically part of the conversation, which was unconvincing. Elias looked at them once, and then looked at Harrow, and did not look at them again. "Sit down," Harrow said. "I'll stand," Elias said. "This won't take long." Something moved in Harrow's face that was not quite displeasure, more like the specific calculation of a man adjusting a social expectation and filing the adjustment. He sat down himself, which was a recovery, taking the desk back as a position of authority. "You've caused considerable disruption in my town," Harrow said. His voice was even, measured, with the cadence of someone who had conducted a great many difficult conversations and understood pacing as a tool. "Your town," Elias said. He said it neutrally, just repeating the phrase. "I've invested significantly in Blackstone Hollow," Harrow said. "The mines, the bank, the commercial operations. This town wouldn't exist in its current form without the Hendricks shaft," Elias said. A pause. "Fractional." The pale eyes adjusted. "An unfortunate accident," Harrow said. "The report was filed 6 days before it happened," Elias said, "with the cause of failure already specified, down to the particular support beam." The room was very quiet. One of the men on the side shifted his weight. Harrow did not move at all, which was a kind of answer. "I don't know what documents you think you've found," Harrow said, his voice remaining even. "But I can assure you that anyone presenting falsified—" "They're not falsified," Elias said. "They're yours, filed by your people, signed by your officers, stamped by the assay office you control." He paused. "I didn't bring them with me today. They're not in this valley anymore." Another pause, longer this time. The pale eyes were working. "You sent them," Harrow said. It was not quite a question. "Yesterday afternoon," Elias said, "eastbound. The circuit judge's office in Millhaven will have them by now, or will shortly." He watched the impact of this move through Harrow's face with the attention of someone who had said hard things to powerful men before and knew that the first reaction was often more informative than anything that followed. What moved through Harrow's face was not panic. Panic was for men who hadn't prepared contingencies. What moved through it was colder than that. A fast, precise recalculation, the kind that happened when a variable you'd been managing changed into a variable you now had to manage differently. "Documents without testimony are often insufficient," Harrow said finally. "Courts require witnesses, witnesses who are present and credible and willing to appear under their own names." "I know that," Elias said. "The people in this valley who might consider testifying have a great deal to consider," Harrow continued. "Their loans, their leases, their relationships with the institutions that keep their operations running." He opened his hand slightly. "It would be unfortunate if financial pressures made it difficult for people to maintain their positions here while a lengthy legal process unfolded." There it was. Stated calmly and without the covering of pretense, the way a man stated things when he believed the room was controlled enough that he didn't need to be subtle. Elias looked at him. "The number 3 shaft," he said. The calculation in Harrow's face shifted again, more fractional this time, harder to read. "Standard maintenance," Harrow said. "There's nothing wrong with the supports in that shaft," Elias said. "Someone who works it regularly and knows it well told me that this morning. The The same person told me it's the shaft where two men who have been asking questions about accident records have been working. A long silence. I don't know what you think you're implying, Harrow said. I think you do, Elias said, and I think you should understand something before you make your next decision. The documents I sent to Millhaven include the Hendricks file, the Henderson records, and 3 years of claim transfer documentation showing a pattern of acquisition that follows a specific sequence: accident or threat, financial pressure, transfer. 14 separate claims. I know the circuit judge's office. I know the people there. This will not sit in a file. You're very confident for a man who walked into my building with nothing in his hands, Harrow said. I walked into your building to make sure you understood the position, Elias said. Not to threaten you. Threats are for people who need leverage. I don't need leverage. The documents are already moving. Then why are you here? Elias looked at him steadily. Because the number 3 shaft, he said, and the 2 men in it are a problem you can still choose not to create. The silence in the room had a different texture now. The 2 men on the sides were very still. Outside the window, the sounds of the morning continued. The town doing its ordinary things, unaware of the conversation happening in this room, which was the thing about conversations like this one. The ordinary world continued around them with complete indifference to the hinge they represented. Harrow looked at Elias for a long moment. His face was composed, and his eyes were working, and whatever he was calculating was happening behind an expression that gave nothing away. Then he said, "You should leave my office now." Elias had expected this. Not a concession. A man like Harrow didn't make concessions in his own office in front of his own people. What he'd expected was this: the conversation ending, and then Harrow having to sit with everything that had been said in it and decide what it meant for what he did next. He left. On the street, the morning sun had climbed high enough to clear the eastern ridge and was hitting the main street at a low, sharp angle that made everything look flatter than it was. Elias stood on the boardwalk in front of the Harrow mining building and felt the specific kind of exposure that came from having just said provocative things to a dangerous man in a room with 2 armed witnesses and considered his next move. He had gotten maybe 40 feet when he heard his name. Not his name exactly. Vane, said from the side, from the alley between the mining building and the hardware merchant next to it. He turned and found, in the shadow of the alley, the last person he had expected to see there. Caleb Rhodes. The marshal was not in uniform. He was in his working clothes. The clothes a man put on when he was doing something in an official capacity that he didn't want to announce as official. His hat was pulled low, and he had the look of someone who had been awake through the night and had made some decision during that time that he was not entirely comfortable with but was committed to. "Walk with me," Rhodes said quietly. "Not together, just in the same direction." They moved separately toward the residential end of the main street, maintaining 30 feet between them, which was enough that nobody watching from the mining building's windows would read it as a conversation. Elias watched the street ahead and listened. Rhodes spoke without looking at him directly. His voice was low and controlled. "Last night, after you left my office, I couldn't sleep," he said. "I went through my own records, things I'd kept even though I told myself they didn't mean anything." He paused. "I have 14 months of incident logs from the Harrow mines. I kept copies, unofficial ones, because something told me to at the time, and I filed the instinct away and mostly ignored what it meant." Another pause. "The pattern you described, the timing on the reports before the incidents, it's in my logs too. I just never looked at it as a pattern." Elias walked. He said nothing. He let Rhodes find his own pace. "The Henderson accident," Rhodes said. "I wrote a report. Official report, which went through the county system and ended up wherever it ended up. But I also wrote a personal account the same night, because the Pitson brothers were men I knew, and I needed somewhere to put it." His voice had a quality in it that was not easy to characterize, not grief exactly, but the specific emotional residue of someone who had been carrying a thing for 4 years without anywhere to set it down. "I wrote down what didn't add up. I put it in a box in my desk, and I put other things on top of it." "Do you still have it?" Elias said. "I have all of it," Rhodes said. They had reached the end of the main street where it curved toward the residential blocks. Rhodes stopped at the corner. He looked at the mountains for a moment, not at Elias. "The number 3 shaft," he said. "I heard about the maintenance closure from a deputy this morning. I looked into it." He stopped. The inspection was ordered by Harrow's mine foreman 2 days ago, before your documents were even sent, which means it's not a response to what you did yesterday. It's something that was already in motion. Elias absorbed this. The two men who worked that shaft, he said. Elmore Dash and Peter Vale, Rhodes said. Both of them have been asking questions through the miners' cooperative about the accident rate in Harrow's operations. Both of them have families. Dash has 4 children. Vale is supporting his mother-in-law. What's your authority over Harrow's mine operations? Elias said. As marshal, I can issue a temporary order suspending operations in a specific location if I have documented safety concerns, Rhodes said. It's a provision in the territorial code. Harrow's lawyers would challenge it within a day, and they'd probably win. But a day is a day. It's enough time, Elias said. Rhodes turned and looked at him directly for the first time during the conversation. His expression was complicated in the way that expressions were complicated when a person was simultaneously doing something right and acutely aware of how long they'd spent not doing it. I need you to understand that this is not going to fix what I've been doing for 4 years, he said. One order doesn't cover that. I know that. I know it too, Elias said. But I can keep Dash and Vale out of that shaft today, Rhodes said, and I can do it with paper and my badge and in front of witnesses. He paused. That's what I have. Then use it, Elias said. Rhodes nodded once. He pulled his hat down slightly and walked back toward the marshal's office. Elias watched him go and then turned and found something he hadn't expected directly across the street. 3 men standing in front of the general merchant, not doing anything, not pretending to be customers. Just standing. Watching the conversation they had just watched, or watching Elias specifically, which was probably the same thing. One of them was the man from the saloon, the one who had walked out with a warning. He had come back, which meant the warning had not been taken or had been superseded by other instructions. Elias looked at them. They looked at him. Then, from further down the street, a voice. Not shouting. Speaking at a volume meant to be heard by more than one person, in the deliberate way that a man spoke when he was choosing to say something publicly that he'd been saying privately for a long time and had decided there was no longer anything to lose. It was Gideon Marsh. I was standing in front of the Land Records building with Nathan Cole beside him, which was not where either of them were supposed to be, which meant that something had happened at the Redtail claim that had changed their plans, and Elias would find out what that was in a moment. But the immediate thing was that Marsh was talking to the street, not to Elias, to the men going past, to the miners walking toward the morning shift, to the merchant who'd come to his own doorway at the sound of a voice in an unusual register, to the woman who'd stopped on the boardwalk across the way with a basket of goods and was looking at the scene with the careful expression of a person calibrating whether this was something to walk away from. My name is Gideon Marsh, Marsh said, loud enough to carry. I've worked the Redtail claim for 4 years. My neighbor Nathan Cole has worked his claim for longer. Both of our loans are held by Harrow's bank. Last night, my claim was visited by men I didn't invite who went through my equipment shed and my records, which I know because I came home this morning to find it exactly like that. People were stopping, not rushing, cautiously, the way people in a controlled environment stop to listen to something that broke the pattern of the controlled environment, uncertain whether proximity was safe. Elias did not move toward Marsh. He stayed where he was and monitored the 3 men across the street and watched the street in both directions. I'm saying this because I'm tired, Marsh continued, and his voice had a quality in it that wasn't anger and wasn't grief, but was the specific, unglamorous exhaustion of a man who had run out of the particular energy it took to be careful. I'm tired of being careful about what I say in my own town. I have been working this valley for 4 years, and I have watched men lose their claims, and I have watched men die in accidents that didn't make sense, and I have told myself it wasn't my place to say anything because saying something was dangerous. He paused. Well, here I am saying something. The 3 men across the street were moving, not toward Marsh, toward each other, the way men moved when they were receiving or communicating instructions. One of them turned and went back in the direction of the Harrow mining building quickly. Cole stepped up beside Marsh. He had the oilskin pouch in his hands, the copies, the ones he'd kept, and he held it up so that it was visible. He didn't say anything, he just held it. And then something happened that Elias had seen before in other places, but that never lost its capacity to surprise him, because it was always specific to the people it happened with, and to the particular moment they'd reached. A miner named Doyle, the man who had come to the boarding house steps the night before with his hat in his hands, came around the corner of the hardware merchant and stood next to Marsh. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, beside a man who was saying something, then another man. Elias didn't know his name. A working man, in mine clothes, with a face that was tired in a way that ran deeper than the morning shift. He came out of the small group that had been watching and stood on that side of the street with the others. One more. A woman this time, middle-aged, with the direct, unsentimental bearing of a person who had made enough hard decisions that one more didn't require a great deal of preparation. She crossed the street and stood near Cole. It was not a crowd. It was not a movement. It was 6 people standing on a public street in a town that had been controlled by one man's gravity for 6 years, and standing was all it was. But standing together was the thing that Harrow's system had always prevented, and it was happening now in the open where anyone could see it. The 3 men across the street had reduced to 2. The third had not come back. Elias moved to where Marsh and Cole were standing. "You were supposed to be at the Red Tail claim," he said to Marsh quietly. "My equipment shed was broken into," Marsh said. At close range, his face showed the strain of the morning. He had not slept either, clearly, and the decision to come into town had been made under pressure and probably had not felt entirely rational at the time. They were looking for the copies, which means they know Cole kept them. "They didn't find them," Cole said. He was still holding the pouch. "No," Marsh said, "because I'd already moved them." He looked at Elias. "The shed was broken into somewhere around 3 in the morning. I found it at first light and went to wake Cole, and we talked about what to do for about 20 minutes. And then Cole said we should come here and say it out loud instead of running, and I told him that was a terrible idea." He paused. "And then I thought about it for another 10 minutes and decided he was right." Elias looked at Cole. Cole had the look of a man who had decided something and was living in the specific and uncomfortable space between the decision and its consequences, which was the space where you really found out what a decision cost. "If I run, the documents travel without me, and the court gets paper with no one behind it. Harrow's lawyers will work on the credibility of the records for months, maybe longer. But if I'm here and visible, and there are people standing with me," he stopped, "then it's harder to make us disappear quietly. You can disappear one person quietly. You can't disappear a public conversation." It was not wrong. Elias had arrived at the same conclusion himself, in a different way, for different reasons. But Cole was right that visibility had its own form of protection, imperfect and unreliable but real. He looked at the people standing there, the miner Doyle, the unnamed man in work clothes, the woman who had crossed the street, Marsh and Cole. He thought about Harrow in his office, recalculating. He thought about Rhodes, somewhere in the building behind him, pulling out 14 months of incident logs and a personal account, written the night 2 brothers didn't come home. He thought about Greer at the Millhaven Junction and a package on a train moving east, and a circuit judge's office that would open its morning mail and find something that required attention. None of these things, individually, were sufficient. He had said that to himself more than once in the past 2 days, and it was still true. But sufficiency was a thing that was sometimes assembled from pieces that were individually insufficient, if the pieces came together in the right configuration at the right moment. He was not certain that was happening. He was not the kind of man who allowed himself certainty about things he couldn't control. But he thought, it might be. The 2 remaining men across the street had stopped moving. They were watching the group on this side of the street with the specific expression of men who had been sent to manage a situation that had developed in an unexpected direction and were waiting for instruction on how to respond to it. Instruction came. Not from the Harrow building, from the side street to the left, where a man Elias hadn't seen before appeared and spoke quietly to them, and then all 3 of them walked away, back toward the Harrow side of town. Withdrawal. Not permanent, but withdrawal. "What happens now?" the woman who had crossed the street said. She directed the question at no one specifically, or at everyone, which was sometimes the same thing. "Now we wait," Elias said, "and we don't scatter." He looked at each person standing there. Whatever Harrow does next, he's going to do it through the systems he controls. The bank, the legal process, the formal mechanisms. Which means it's going to take time. And we have time because the documents are already in Millhaven and what's started can't be unstarted. "He could still move on the shaft," Doyle said. He had not been there for the conversation with Rhodes, and Elias had not told him about it. "The marshal is issuing a suspension order on the number 3 shaft this morning," Elias said. Doyle stared at him. "Rhodes." His voice carried the specific skepticism of a man who had watched someone operate a certain way for a long time. "Rhodes," Elias said. A silence. Then the unnamed miner in work clothes said quietly, "I'll believe that when I see it." They didn't have to wait long. 40 minutes later, Caleb Rhodes came down the main street in his marshal's uniform, which he had apparently taken the time to put on, with 2 deputies behind him. He walked with the specific bearing of a man who had made a decision and was not permitting himself to reconsider it in transit, because reconsidering it in transit was where the version of himself that had been making bad decisions for 4 years lived, and he was not going back there. He carried a document in his hand. He walked past the group on the street, past Elias, past Cole and Marsh, and the people standing with them, and continued down the street toward the Harrow mining building, and then past that, toward the mine site itself. He did not look at Elias as he passed. Elias didn't expect him to. That wasn't the kind of moment that required acknowledgement between them. What it required was for Rhodes to keep walking in the direction he was walking, which he did. The group on the street watched him go. The unnamed miner looked at Doyle. Doyle looked at Elias. Elias said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the moment hadn't already said more plainly. The morning continued around them. The sun climbed. The town moved through its ordinary operations, slightly altered, in the way that towns were altered by things that happened publicly in them. Not transformed, not resolved, but shifted by some increment that was felt before it was understood. Men going to the saloon walked past the group on the street, and some of them kept walking and some of them slowed. 2 stopped. One of those who stopped knew Gideon Marsh and said something to him quietly, and Marsh answered, and the man stayed. Then another. The group that had been 6 people became 8, then 10, without anyone making a speech about it or asking anyone to join. People made their own decisions for their own reasons. A man whose brother had died in a shaft 4 years ago and who had never found a way to say so publicly. A woman whose claim transfer she'd always believed was not right, but had never had the documentation to prove. A merchant who had been paying Harrow a percentage of his revenue for 3 years in an arrangement that had been presented to him as standard business practice, and that he had suspected for 2 years was not. They stood on the street in the morning light, and they were not an army, and they were not a movement. They were people who had reached the specific limit of compliance that every controlled system eventually produced, if it ran long enough and asked too much. Victor Harrow did not come out of his building. He was in there. Elias was certain of that, because a man like Harrow understood that what was happening on the street was significant and would not be absent from the window for it. He was watching. He was calculating. And for the first time in 6 years, the calculation was not going the way it always had. Elias stepped back from the group slightly, not leaving but creating a little distance, and let the thing breathe on its own. It didn't need him at the center of it. It probably needed him less at the center than he was instinctively inclined to be, because he had learned that the things that lasted were the things that people owned for themselves, not the things they borrowed from someone passing through. The morning held. Nobody moved on the shaft. The papers traveled east, and in Harrow's building, behind a window, a man who had believed for 6 years that he understood the precise weight of every person's fear, began to understand that he had misestimated something fundamental, not by a little, but by the kind of margin that changed what was possible. Elias looked at the mountains. The light on them was clean and hard and very far away. He thought, "It's not over." He knew it wasn't over. There were still mechanisms in motion that Harrow controlled, and the court process was slow and the coming days would not be simple for anyone on this street. But something had moved that had not moved in 6 years, and movement was its own kind of beginning, regardless of what came next. The days that followed were not clean. That was the first thing Elias would have said to anyone who asked him later how it ended, if anyone had asked, which they didn't, because by the time it ended he was already somewhere else. But the not cleanness of it mattered, because stories about places like Blackstone Hollow had a way of getting simplified in the retelling. The corrupt man falls, the town is freed, something resolves with the satisfying click of a mechanism completing its intended function. The actual experience was slower and more ragged than that, with more waiting and more uncertainty and more moments where the outcome was genuinely unclear, which was the way consequential things almost always went when you were inside them, rather than looking back. The circuit judge's office in Millhaven received the package on a Wednesday morning. Elias knew this because Greer sent word through the supply runner 3 days after the train left. A single line, written on a strip of paper the size of a finger, received and opened by Hendricks personally. Hendricks was the senior circuit judge. Greer had found this out through a contact at the freight station, which meant Greer had been paying attention to the downstream consequences of what he'd done, which meant he had not been able to set it down and stop thinking about it, which Elias understood completely. The response from Millhaven was not immediate. That was the nature of formal processes. They had their own momentum and their own friction, and they did not accelerate because the situation on the ground was urgent. Elias spent the first 3 days after the confrontation on the main street doing the specific, unglamorous work of keeping things from deteriorating faster than they could be addressed. Harrow moved through his remaining mechanisms with the efficiency of a man who understood that his window was closing and was trying to close as many doors as he could before it shut entirely. The bank issued formal notices of review to 6 miners whose loans were held there, including Cole and Marsh. These were not immediate calls. Territorial law required a 60-day notice period before a loan could be formally called, but they were the opening move in a legal process designed to create enough financial uncertainty that people would reconsider the wisdom of standing on public streets and saying things. 2 of the 6 miners, after receiving their notices, came to Elias. He sat with them in the back room of the Dust River Saloon, which Denton had made available with the wordless efficiency of a man who had decided, sometime in the last several days, that his neutrality had a limit. He listened to both miners carefully and then told them the same thing he'd told everyone who came to him with a version of the same fear. A 60-day notice is a 60-day notice, and the investigation in Millhaven had already begun, which meant that any legal action Harrow initiated through the bank would be subject to scrutiny by the territorial authority for the duration of the proceedings. It wasn't protection, it was a complication. But complication was sometimes the difference between a man acting and a man waiting, and right now waiting was what they needed Harrow to do. The miners left with something that was not quite reassurance but was closer to it than what they'd come in with. Elias was not in the business of making promises he couldn't keep. What he could give people was an honest accounting of the situation, and in his experience an honest accounting was more useful than a comfortable one, even when the honest accounting was harder to hear. On the 4th day, Harrow made a mistake. He sent a man to Gideon Marsh's claim at night, not to threaten, not to damage, but to remove the equipment. Specifically, the ore processing equipment that Marsh used to work his claims, which Harrow's lawyers had identified as having been purchased through a credit arrangement that had a provision, buried in the original agreement, written in the specific language that provisions meant not to be found were written in, that allowed for repossession under certain conditions of default, and which Harrow's bank had determined those conditions had been met. It was legally arguable. That was the point. It was the kind of move that put a man in the position of spending months in a territorial court arguing about contract language while his claim sat unworked. Marsh came into town the next morning and reported it to Caleb Rhodes. Rhodes documented it. He sent a formal inquiry to Harrow's bank requesting the specific contractual basis for the repossession. He did this in writing, on official paper, with copies sent to the territorial authority in Millhaven, not because he thought the bank would reverse the action, but because documentation was the language this particular fight was being conducted in, and he had decided to be fluent in it. It was not dramatic. It was paperwork. But it was paperwork from a marshal who had chosen a side, which was different from the paperwork of the previous 4 years, and Harrow's lawyers received it and understood the difference. The repossession was reversed within 48 hours. Not with an apology. Men like Harrow's lawyers did not apologize, they adjusted, but reversed. Marsh got his equipment back. He came to find Elias afterward, and they stood outside the boarding house in the early evening, and Marsh looked at the equipment that had been returned and was quiet for a moment. "I never thought I'd see that go back the way it came," he said. "It's not over," Elias said. "I know that," Marsh said. "I'm not celebrating. I'm just—" He paused. "I'm noting it, that it happened." Elias understood the distinction. There was something important in acknowledging the small reversals as they occurred, not because they were the end of anything, but because a man who didn't acknowledge them risked losing track of the fact that things were moving, and losing track of that was how people gave up. The investigators from Millhaven arrived on day 9. There were 3 of them, 2 men from the Territorial Authority and one who identified himself only as representing the Federal Land Commissioner's office, which told Elias that the package had moved further than Millhaven, that someone there had understood the federal dimension of land fraud across territorial claim boundaries and had involved the relevant parties. The 3 men were professional and thorough and uninterested in the town's existing social architecture, which was exactly what was needed and exactly what locally controlled processes could never provide. They set up in the Land Records building, which caused a particular and satisfying irony given that the building's records were among the most incriminating documents in the entire case. Nathan Cole spent 4 days with them, going through everything, explaining the pattern, identifying the specific documents and their anomalies, and the chain of reasoning that connected them to outcomes. He came out of those sessions each evening looking like a man who had been doing hard, necessary labor, exhausted, not quite settled, carrying the specific weight of someone who had said difficult things under formal conditions and was living with the aftermath of having said them. Elias checked on him each evening, not extensively, just enough to make sure Cole was eating and sleeping and wasn't disappearing into his own head in ways that would become a problem. On the second evening, Cole said, "They asked me why I kept the records, why I didn't just leave." "What did you tell them?" Elias said. Cole looked at his hands. "I told them I didn't have anywhere better to be," he said. Then quietly, "Which is partly true. But the real reason is that those men, the Pitson brothers, the Henderson crew, they didn't get to leave. And it seemed wrong to leave on their behalf." Elias didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "That's the real reason." Cole looked up. "I know," he said. "I just don't always say it out loud because it sounds—" He stopped. "It sounds like something," Elias agreed, not finishing the sentence because Cole hadn't needed him to. Victor Harrow was formally placed under territorial investigation on day 11. The notice was served by one of the men from Millhaven at the Harrow Mining Building in the presence of 2 witnesses. Harrow received it in his office with the controlled, composed expression of a man who had known this was coming and had been preparing his response for days, which he had been. His lawyers were in from the county seat within 24 hours, and the legal machinery that followed was complex and slow and not fully resolved for months. But the investigation itself was the thing. The investigation made public what had been private and made institutional what had been individual, and placed the weight of territorial authority on the side of the people who had been carrying everything alone. The number 3 shaft was inspected by the territorial investigators. What they found in the support structures was documented. Elias did not see the report, but he saw the faces of the investigators when they came out of the shaft, and their faces were the faces of people who had confirmed something they wished they hadn't had to confirm. Elmore Dash and Peter Vale, the 2 miners who had been asking questions about the accident records, were interviewed separately. Both of them said the same things they'd been saying quietly for 2 years, and this time someone with authority wrote it down on official paper. Doyle came to find Elias after his own interview. He stood in the street with his hat in his hands again. The same posture as that night on the boarding house steps, which Elias noticed and thought was probably habitual, the body expressing what the words didn't. He said the investigators had asked him about the shaft maintenance schedule and about what he'd observed and about the conversation he'd had with Elias that night. "I told them everything," Doyle said, "including that I came to you first." "That's fine," Elias said. "They asked me why I came to you instead of the marshal." He paused. "I told them I didn't know if the marshal was safe at the time." He looked at Elias carefully. "Was that the wrong thing to say?" "It was the true thing to say," Elias said. "Which is better?" Doyle turned his hat in his hands. "Rhodes he's been different," he said, with the hesitant precision of someone trying to be fair to a person they'd written off. "Since all this started, he's been doing his job like his job means something." "It took him a while," Elias said. "It did," Doyle agreed. And then, after a moment, "I've done things that took me a while too. Doesn't necessarily mean they don't count when you finally do them." It was a generous thing to say about a man who had let the valley suffer under bad choices for 4 years. Elias thought that generosity of that kind was itself a complicated thing, not naivety, but something more deliberate, an active choice to measure people by what they managed eventually rather than only by what they failed to do when it was harder. I wasn't sure he was built for that kind of generosity himself, but he recognized it in Doyle as something real and considered. Caleb Rhodes submitted his personal account of the Henderson accident to the territorial investigators on day 13, the 14 months of incident logs, the copy of the report he'd written the night the Pitson brothers died. He submitted them without being asked, which mattered in a way that being asked and complying would not have mattered quite as much. Margaret Rhodes heard about it from her husband that evening. Elias heard about it the following morning from Clara Finch, who seemed to know most things in Blackstone Hollow at roughly the speed they happened, which was a function of 11 years of running a boarding house and paying attention. She cried, Clara said, matter-of-factly. Not for sadness. The other kind. Elias thought about Margaret Rhodes in her backyard, hanging laundry, with careful eyes that had been doing a great deal of work quietly for a long time. He thought about what 4 years of watching someone you loved make decisions you couldn't reach into and change actually cost a person, measured not in dramatic moments, but in the accumulation of ordinary days lived beside a compromise. He was glad she got to cry the other kind. On day 15, Elias packed his saddlebags. It was morning, early, the same hour he'd been waking since he arrived, the mountain town coming alive in the dark, with its mine bells and its livestock and its accumulated ordinary sounds. He packed with the efficiency of a man who had never fully unpacked, who had always kept his things in a configuration that could be gathered quickly, which was a habit formed from necessity that had become so ingrained he'd stopped noticing it as a choice. Clara Finch was in the kitchen. She looked at the saddlebags when he came downstairs and said nothing for a moment. Then, "You're leaving before breakfast." "I need an early start," he said. "You need breakfast," she said, and put a plate on the table with the finality of someone who was not going to argue about it, but was also not going to be argued with. He sat down and ate. The food was simple and good, in the way that simple food was good when it was made by someone who knew what they were doing and cared about it without making a production of the caring. "The investigation will take months," Clara said. She wasn't asking. "It will," he said. "The territorial process is slow. Harrow's lawyers are good. Some of what was done will be harder to prove than other parts. The land transfers are the cleanest piece. Those can be undone through the courts if the fraud is established, and the documentation for that is strong." He paused. "The deaths are harder to prosecute legally. The pattern is clear, but pattern isn't always the same as proof to a judge's satisfaction." "And Harrow himself?" Elias considered this. Men like Harrow rarely end up in prison. The mechanisms they build are designed partly to insulate them from direct accountability. He'll lose the mining operations. The investigations will make operating them impossible. He'll lose the bank's position in the valley. The land transfers will be challenged and most of them reversed. He looked at his plate. "Whether he faces criminal charges depends on things I can't control from here." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Does that bother you?" "Yes," Elias said, simply, without elaboration. "But you're leaving anyway." "The people who need to be here are here," he said. "Cole, Marsh, Doyle, Rhodes, the investigators. This part of it doesn't need me." He paused. "And I have a habit of staying too long in places and convincing myself I'm still useful when what I'm actually doing is something else." Clara looked at him with the direct, assessing look that she'd been giving him since the first day, the look that said she had opinions and had decided to share one. "What else?" He thought about this honestly. "Making myself part of the outcome," he said. "Needing to see how it resolves, which is its own kind of wanting something from a place, even if you tell yourself you don't." She was quiet for a moment, then, "That sounds like something a person who spent a long time not belonging anywhere would struggle with." He didn't answer. She hadn't entirely needed him to. He finished breakfast and stood up and picked up his saddlebags. "There's a family named Cole that's going to need help navigating a 60-day loan notice," he said. "And Marsh has the same situation. The territorial investigators can't assist with that directly, but a letter from someone with knowledge of the case, explaining the context to the bank's oversight body. I know people who know people," Clara said. "I've been running this boarding house for 11 years. "I know," he said. He left 2 weeks' worth of room payment on the table, which was more than he owed and less than he felt, and walked out into the morning. I went to the livery and saddled the bay mare, who accepted this with the equanimity of an animal that had been places and understood that departure was part of what travel meant. He led her out into the street. The town was in its early morning configuration, not fully awake, not fully quiet, in the particular state of transition that the hour before full activity produced. The mine bell had rung, but the shift hadn't fully organized itself yet. The main street had a few people moving through it with the purposeful half-attention of people going about the start of their day. He was mounted and turning the mare toward the south road when he heard his name. Nathan Cole was coming down the street at a pace that was not quite running, the pace of a man who had been told something was happening and had moved toward it without allowing himself to look like he was rushing, which was its own kind of dignity. He stopped a few feet from the horse and looked up at Elias with the expression he'd had in the cabin. That specific combination of relief and continuing anxiety that had characterized him since the beginning, which Elias suspected was simply how Nathan Cole's face was arranged when something important was happening, and he was not sure how it was going to end. "You're leaving," Cole said. "I am." Cole looked at the saddlebags, then at the horse, then back at Elias. He seemed to be working through something. "I don't know how to—" He stopped. Started again. "You came here because of the documents, because you found something in a land office 300 miles away, and you couldn't leave it alone. You didn't know me. You didn't know Marsh or Doyle or any of us." "No," Elias said, "and you're leaving before you know how it ends." "You know how it ends," Elias said, "not the fine details, not the court dates, and the specific findings, but the shape of it. The investigation is running. The documents are official record. Rhodes submitted his account. The shaft is documented. Harrow is managing investigators instead of managing the valley." He looked at Cole. "The shape of it is changed. That's how it ends." Cole was quiet for a moment. What if it's not enough? It was the question Elias had been asking himself in various forms since the first night in this town, and he had not arrived at a clean answer, because clean answers were not generally available to this kind of question. "Then it's not enough," he said, "and the people here keep working with what they have, which is more than they had 2 weeks ago." He paused. "I've seen places where things got this far, and then the formal process failed, where the courts were too slow or too compromised, or the evidence wasn't quite enough for the standard of proof required. It happens." He looked at Cole steadily. "But I've also seen that in those places, what had been done before the process failed still mattered. It mattered to the people who had done it. It mattered to what the town became afterward. Because there's something that changes in a place when people stop pretending the wrong thing isn't happening and start saying it out loud. Even if the formal outcome is incomplete, that change is real, and it's hard to reverse." Cole looked at him for a long moment. "You really believe that?" he said. Not quite a question. "I've had to believe it," Elias said, "because it's the only thing that makes the work worth doing when the outcomes are uncertain, which they always are." Cole nodded slowly. "I was working through this the way he worked through everything, carefully, without hurrying it, giving it the attention it required." Then he said, Do you have somewhere you're going after this?" "There's a thread," Elias said. "Another land office, different valley, same kind of arithmetic not adding up." Cole almost smiled. It didn't quite get there, but it was close. "You can't leave it alone," he said. "No," Elias agreed. "It's a consistent problem." Cole put his hand up. Not for a handshake exactly, more the gesture of a man acknowledging something that didn't have a cleaner form. Elias looked at it for a moment, and then reached down and took it. They held that for 2 seconds. Then Elias turned the mare south and rode out of Blackstone Hollow in the early morning light. He did not look back. He had a practice of not looking back at places he was leaving, which was not sentimentality in reverse, but simply an understanding of himself. That looking back had a way of pulling him into a version of the past that competed with paying attention to what was in front of him, and what was in front of him was always the more urgent concern. The road south was the same road he'd come in on, which gave it a different character now than it had had then. The mountains were the same. The light was the same quality, early, hard, indifferent. But a man coming out of a place knew different things about it than a man arriving did, and those different things made the landscape feel altered in a way that had nothing to do with the landscape. He rode for 2 hours before he let himself think about any of it. What he thought about first was not the investigation or the documents or Harrow or the shaft or any of the mechanisms that had been set in motion. He thought about Doyle, standing on the boarding house steps in the dark with his hat turning in his hands, afraid and present. He thought about Gideon Marsh standing in front of the Land Records building saying his name out loud because he was tired of being careful and had decided that tiredness was finally sufficient reason to stop. He thought about Margaret Rhodes in her yard with laundry in her hands, carrying 4 years of her husband's choices alongside her own in a silence that had never been passivity, only patience of a very specific and costly kind. He thought about what those things actually were, stripped of any framing that made them larger or more legible than they were in the moment they happened. They were ordinary people reaching the limit of a particular kind of endurance and deciding, when they reached it, to do something small and specific and real rather than nothing. Not heroism. Not the dramatic version of courage that required exceptional circumstances to recognize. The daily, granular, unglamorous version. The version that most people who did it never got credited for because it looked from the outside too much like simply living their lives. This was the thing Elias had been thinking about for 15 years of moving through places like Blackstone Hollow, and he had not arrived at a conclusion so much as a working understanding that he revised every time he came out the other side of a situation. The working understanding was this: corruption of the kind that Harrow had built was not primarily a feature of powerful men. Powerful men were its instrument, but they were not its essential condition. The essential condition was the specific, accumulated weight of small decisions made by ordinary people over a long period of time. Decisions to look away, to accept terms they knew were wrong, to tell themselves that their individual compliance was too small to matter. Harrow's empire was built from those decisions as much as from his own deliberate cruelty. It was held together by them. It could only be dismantled by their reversal, which meant that what Nathan Cole had done with 3 years of careful record-keeping, and what Gideon Marsh had done by standing on a street and saying his name, and what Doyle had done by coming to a stranger's door in the dark, and what Aldous Greer had done by putting a package on a train, these were not supporting actions in a story whose main engine was something else. They were the main engine. Elias himself was a catalyst at best. He had moved faster and with fewer local constraints than anyone already inside the situation, which gave him a particular kind of usefulness at a particular moment. But the thing that had actually worked, the thing that had shifted the ground, was all those ordinary people deciding one by one that the cost of continued silence had become higher than the cost of speaking. That was not a comfortable conclusion, because it meant that the failure to reach it earlier, the 6 years of Harrow's operation before anything changed, was also on those ordinary people, and on the accumulation of their small decisions in the wrong direction. It was both things simultaneously. The people of Blackstone Hollow had been victims of a system designed to exploit them, and they had also been participants in the maintenance of it. Both of those things were true, and holding both of them at the same time without collapsing one into the other was the honest version of understanding what had happened in that valley. Elias was not in the business of assigning blame to people for surviving in conditions that were designed to make resistance expensive. But he also wasn't in the business of pretending that surviving and resisting were the same thing, because they weren't, and pretending they were was a way of making the resisting seem less significant than it was. The people who had finally stood on that street had done something harder than what came before it, and harder than what Elias himself had done, because they had to live there afterward with everything they'd said, and everyone who'd watched them say it, and all the consequences that followed. He would be gone. They would be there. That was the real difference between a man who passed through places and the people who remained in them. The ones who remained carried it in their bodies, in the specific weight of the valley's mornings, in the faces they passed on the street every day, in the ongoing work of holding a changed thing in its changed shape against the constant pressure of time and fatigue and the human tendency to drift back toward what was familiar, even when what was familiar was wrong. He had enormous respect for that. He also knew he wasn't built for it. He had learned that about himself a long time ago in a different place, and he'd made his peace with it the way you made your peace with the shape of who you were. Not happily, exactly, but honestly. The thread pulled. Another valley. Another set of records that didn't quite add up. Another place where the arithmetic of power had been running long enough to become invisible to everyone inside it. He turned the mare onto the eastern fork of the road, away from the southern route he'd originally planned, because the eastern fork went toward the next thing, and the next thing was where he was going. The mountains fell behind him. Blackstone Hollow held its changed shape without him in it, because that was the nature of changed things. They didn't require the person who had helped change them to remain in place. They required the people who lived inside them, which was a different requirement entirely. In the Dust River Saloon, Denton washed glasses behind the bar as he always did in the morning, with the window light coming in at an angle across the counter. On the shelf behind him, among the bottles, there was a single empty whiskey glass set apart from the others. Not dramatically, not with any particular staging, just placed where it was and left there. He didn't think about it consciously every day, but he never moved it. And in a town that was still working through the slow, imperfect, grinding business of becoming something different from what it had been, in a valley where the mines were now under scrutiny and the bank's operations were being reviewed and the court process was moving at its own unhurried pace, and people were having conversations in the open that they'd been having only inside their own heads for 6 years. That glass sat on its shelf in the Dust River Saloon and was, for anyone who saw it and knew the story, a record of something true. Not that one man had come through and fixed everything. It had not been fixed. It was being worked on by imperfect people with incomplete information in conditions that were better but not easy. What the glass recorded was simpler and more specific than that. It recorded a moment when a man who understood he was about to face something dangerous chose, before he faced it, to finish what he had in front of him. To be fully present in the moment before the hard thing, not diminished by what was coming, not rushing past what was current in his anxiety about what was next. It was a small thing to leave behind, but small things, left in the right places, had a way of lasting longer than anyone expected when they left them. The mare's hooves on the eastern road made their steady, unhurried sound against the packed earth, and the mountain stayed large for a long time in every direction, and Elias Vane rode toward whatever came next without looking back.